All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're glad to be with you. We're 5 or 6 weeks even into being together with your group, and we just really hope that some really great relationships are forming, and that you're getting to know people, getting to know where they are with the Lord, and we're excited about this lesson.
I feel like every week we kind of get together and plan, and I feel like we say the same thing every week, which is, I love this lesson. There's so many iconic parts of the story. There's so many things about either the human condition or leadership lessons. And so I feel like this lesson is just like all the other ones that keep coming. And so it's been rich. And so as we jump in, clearly this lesson kind of falls in between Israel's exodus out of the Red Sea and before we get to their receiving of the Mosaic Law. And so this kind of lesson falls right in between those two huge moments in Israel's history. And so the question becomes, why is this section here, and what is God doing? In a sense, to put it maybe as cutely as one could, God has gotten Israel out of Egypt, but he's going to try to get Egypt out of them in the midst of these chapters as he kind of prepares them, moving them from redemption, in a sense, justification, into now sanctification, as he begins to form them and, in a sense, maybe even reorient and retrain them to a new way of living. And so a lot of the moments and the stories that come out of here are going to be kind of highlighting kind of who they've become and how he's going to kind of be changing them to become something different.
Yeah, so good. Again, we have our first 6 questions that you can go over. What were some of the things that jumped out to you, Trey?
Yeah, one of the ones that I usually am not a big win guy on these questions, timing wise, but I thought question 3 kind of asking, are there any time periods mentioned? And the first encounter of grumbling that Israel's going to have is 3 days after the Red Sea. So that was the first thing that kind of caught me at the end of chapter 15 is we're 3 days out of seeing God do a miraculous water miracle. And 3 days after that, they're grumbling, complaining about a water problem that clearly it would seem that God has under control, which he'll prove to them yet again. And so that, and then 45 days later after the Red Sea, they're in the wilderness. We're going to get into the manna kind of thing. And so it's interesting to see time kind of passing in the midst of their own kind of experiences. And so there's 5 different places. Some of them are more interesting. Some of their names of the places will have meaning as well as we kind of walk through those different instances and the things God's teaching. And so the repetition of grumbling kind of gets us into the irony in the second part of this. And so walk us through that.
Yeah, so our observation skill is identifying irony in this section, which there are several places where you could find that, I think. And yeah, thinking about the incidents, question 1 there, of the noting the times that they grumble, that might be something, just as a way to get into the lesson too, specifically just asking people, where'd you find that? What's happening? Where is it happening? And what's God's response to the grumbling? I think that's another interesting thing you could do there. And so the irony in this section, we were talking about it, and I think one of the big things that pops out is what actually the first set of grumbling is that has to do with water, but what God does what's ironic about it is that the first plague was also about water. And so God took water that was drinkable and made it unfit to be drank, turned it into blood so they couldn't drink it. And now here he's taking bitter water and making it drinkable. So again, just as this, this irony, this twist, he's making something expected turn into unexpected, all to show who he is, all to prove his power, his provision. That's one that jumped out to me. The other kind of just ironic thing is here they are. They've come out of this place where there's water available, lots of food. They have what they need, although they're oppressed. Now they're in a wilderness. They're oppressed under a bad God, and now they're in this wilderness where there's a lack of provision in the environment, but they have a good God who's taking care of them.
I think one of the other ironies for me kind of walking through their experiences, and we'll kind of talk about why we should probably be a little empathetic towards them, but you kind of see the human condition. So on one hand, you see God's incredible strength and might, but on another hand, I think you see their incredible fragility and how the uncertainty of their circumstances means that they're so quick to doubt and to fear, even though God has consistently shown how mighty and powerful he is. And so to me, you kind of have his almightiness and their fragility kind of side by side in a way that kind of is meant to kind of be a flashpoint for us. which kind of gets into question 3 on that observation section is, what are the attributes of God we see demonstrated in these events? And so clearly we see his strength, his power. I also think as we see them grumble and him kind of provide each and every time when we might have a tendency to both scratch our heads and scoff at them, he's incredibly seemingly patient, enduring. There's a moment at the end of chapter 15, one of the places is called Elim, and it says that there's 12 springs, there's 70 date palms, and so there's this a lavishness of his provision, not just as a creator, but I think also as a guide who's kind of moving them along in a journey. And so to not only create a place like that, but then to bring them to it on the backside of all the things that they've walked through, it shows to me just his gentleness, his kindness, and that he's a God who provides. The other thing I kind of will highlight, and we'll see this a little bit, is he's also, it seems, a God who's a healer of bitterness. He's a provider of satisfaction, and he's also a refresher of fatigue. And so we kind of see these things about him in the midst of the different grumblings and complaints that they have as we walk through this.
Yeah, so good. And then as we get into our interpretation questions this week, the very first one there is, so what are the purposes that God uses in this journey in the wilderness to form his people? So right away in 15:25, you see that it says that when after the first grumbling, he's like, this is for your testing. There's a testing motif kind of coming through there. It's also in 16:4. And it's a testing to prove both parties in this relationship, I think. So God is taking them through these circumstances to see and test, to see if they will trust him and not themselves or their former trust structures, whatever those were. And I think also repeated several times is the purpose statement that says, so that you will know it is the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. So he gave them his covenant name, Yahweh, the Lord. And so in 16:6, 8, 11, and in verse 11 of chapter 18, he says, so that you will know that it is the Lord who rescued you. So how does he use the provision of manna to kind of prove who he is and to test them as well? I thought it was really interesting that he gives them something, his provision is unexpected and it's surprising. It's like, manna means like, what is this stuff? We don't know. It's something clearly from him. It's given daily. It's given. It's not worked for, which all of these things are so different from what they've experienced before. And then we noticed in chapter 16, verse 35, it says they actually had manna provided for them for 40 years. The whole entire time they're in the wilderness, they're receiving manna. How, as Trey said, did their past experiences, impact how they were responding? It's just like us with our past baggage that we bring into relationships. We're really asking, are you going to be this old way that I'm used to? Or are you, whoever I'm relating to, going to be trustworthy and that I can change the way I've related in the past?
It's interesting. You used the phrase a little bit ago, kind of maybe flipping their trust structures, and you kind of used an analogy earlier as we were talking that I liked, the idea that it's almost as if God and Israel are getting to know one another in a dating relationship. And so we get to the Mosaic Law, they're going to marry and commit to one another. And so throughout these chapters, it seems that God is showing that he's trustworthy. And he's also, in a sense, testing to see whether they will be trustworthy to follow. And so some of this, I think, is showing in the manner that God provides that he's trustworthy. And it's interesting to me that his provision never moves them beyond sustained dependency because it comes every single day. Yeah. And so we'll kind of get into Sabbath here in a minute. But I think these chapters, it's just really easy to laugh at them of how dramatic their grumbling can be. I'd rather have died in Egypt. Are there not more graves in Egypt? Why did you have to bring us out here to kill us, right? And so it's easy to kind of scoff at them. But I think if we kind of get a sense, a freshness of the trauma that they went through and how that was so transformative, even at an identity and a psychological level, that ultimately these chapters are beginning to kind of retrain them
Yeah.
that they can trust God and that God can trust them as well.
Mm.
It's interesting as we kind of jump into question 2, Sabbath is kind of dropped in here in chapter 16, verse 23. It's going to be referenced again. It's the fourth of the 10 commandments in Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. We cross-reference as well in chapter 31, verses 12 to 17, in which we see even more about this practice of Sabbath. And so one of our application questions at the end, kind of one of our spiritual practices, we're going to talk a lot more about Sabbath. And we'll kind of get into the hows and the wheres and kind of how do we actually do it well and what are some traps to avoid. But ultimately, what was Sabbath? It was this, in a sense, mandated stop work order on the nation of Israel. That after years of slavery in which they worked 7 days a week, they had no idea of what a healthy rhythm of work and rest looked like. And so God is beginning to reshape for them their rhythms of life, but also beginning to help them realize that they were meant to rest and it was a gift. And that he was going to provide for them to such an extent that there was going to be enough even for a day in which they could stop and rest. They didn't have to keep working just to stay ahead or to kind of have their bellies fed. And so it's interesting, even as you kind of look at some of these references in Exodus, that to disobey the Sabbath order would have brought death. Like it was that serious of something for the Lord as he gave this to the nation. It was a gift, but there was a seriousness to the gift, even in Exodus chapter 31, relating to the Mosaic law and all the pieces of it. It'll be referred to almost as a sign of the covenant, that in the midst of all the commands that he had for the nation of Israel, as he's going to train them on what it looks like to worship him and to walk with him, this particular command of Sabbath, he's going to lift with a level of significance and notoriety that he wants us to make sure they don't miss. And I think for people who are coming out of slavery, to learn what rest was and to see it as a gift and to trust that their provider had provided them enough to be able to rest and put down the worries of the world and to actually put their attention on him and to worship was a huge retraining and a huge rhythm kind of resetter that is going to be one of the biggest pieces of this new way of life that he wants them to grab.
Yeah, so good. You'll notice that the interpretation skill this week is to look at keywords, and we're asking to use the word Sabbath. And so if your group has never really talked about that, you might want to bring your laptop and just get on the netbible.org and click on and show them exactly how to do it. One thing to note is that in the Net Bible where the text is, there are also what they call net notes. And what I found more helpful even than the word study portion on that website was the actual net note, because it did say that Sabbath was a cessation for holiness. So it's kind of this combination word, holy Sabbath. And so it kind of gives you the purpose sort of built in. As Trey said, it's not just stopping for any old reason. It's stopping for a holy purpose, a set aside to be a connection to the Lord. So yeah, just make sure and ask your group about that. All right, as we get into question 3 and transition away from sort of the grumbling narratives there, what is really interesting is that at the end of 17, or I should say the middle, 17:7, it says that Moses brought all the elders together and he called them to the place of Massah and Meribah because the Israelites had quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So we end that section in the grumbling, and they're like, is he with us? Is he for us? Is he against us? We're confused here. And the two incidents that happen right after that are really an answer to that question. So the first thing that happens is they are attacked by the Amalekites. Okay, so these external forces are coming against them unprovoked. So the Amalekites were descendants of Esau. They were a nomadic tribe. They were roaming around in that region, and they may have heard of this big group of people. And so they attack. And so the significance is God with us or against us? And so you see in that narrative, God is definitely for them. He is with them standing when Moses is lifting up his arms. God is with him. We also see
Jethro.
I was going to say we see Joshua. Sorry, I was like, who's that other J name? Joshua for the first time coming up in the story as well. Of course, he's huge in the rest of the narrative. But and then we have that external force where God shows when we're being attacked, he's with us. But then also Jethro. So to me, that was war. And then what happens when we get into the section about Jethro is welcoming him back. So he's his father-in-law. He brings his wife and his sons. So it's this respite for Moses and the people, in a sense, as they get to the base of Mount Sinai. And the significance of Jethro, what were some of the things you saw?
Yeah, I think for me, a couple of things was one, you kind of have, I think, the sense of God's going to be victorious for the nation in the midst of their dependency against the Amalekites. And then I think kind of with Jethro's example, God will be victorious through his people through delegation. So you kind of have this idea of Moses isn't the warrior, God is the warrior. And so the nation is successful as Moses is dependent as a leader. But he's not dependent and holding it all to himself. He's trusting the Lord, but he's also delegating and empowering other leaders within the nation. So much of what you get in this kind of example that unfolds in 18 is this empowering of other leaders, this invitation into leadership collectively. And that Moses isn't to hold it all, either just independence unilaterally with the Lord, but to ultimately to share that load amongst other leaders within the nation. The other thing I like is I think the Amalekites and Jethro are a bit of a foil. Both are outsiders to the nation of Israel. One is going to not have faith in God and fight the nation. One will have faith in God and, in a sense, support the nation.
Yeah, so good.
Kind of our last section on application, and at least for me, I personally am enjoying the study because there's an ease to get to application, and I don't always feel it that easy, but there's just so many things that pop out, and so this is one of those weeks where sometimes we try to highlight one question, and I would just tell you, we think the first three questions are all really good and probably provide a lot of really helpful questions. I would probably add to the first question a little bit, and so we kind of referenced, Israel is going to have gone through all kinds of past difficulty. Then they escape out of the Red Sea. Their great oppressors are killed and crushed. It would seem like life's going to be easy, but what we see is there's still going to be difficulty in the journey with the Lord. And so how does difficulty and struggle in those circumstances, what do they teach us about the Lord? The other thing I'd add in here, because I think you kind of see it in the first grumbling that the nation experiences on the backside of the Red Sea, is they had bitter water. And I think it's not coincidental. I think that there was a bitterness that had taken root probably within the nation of Israel that they had to process through. And ultimately, I think one of the things we see here from the very outset is God is a healer of bitterness, that he's a healer of those past circumstances that have left us not just raw, but sometimes hurt. And at times we can hold on to those things in a bitter way. And so I think he's trying to teach the nation, I can heal those things. And so I think there's a helpfulness in question one to even add in the element of, are there things that are not just been difficult, but they've left you bitter? And have we processed those things with the Lord? Have we just kind of held those things, or have we buried those things? That I think in a sense, as God brings Israel out of Egypt, he's working through those elements, first beginning with bitterness, then fatigue, and then ultimately trying to teach them where their satisfaction can be found. So that's the first question. The second question also kind of gets back into this issue of rest, which we think really sets up for the practice of Sabbath that we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about as well. And so I think it's helpful to ask people, is rest a naturally easy thing or not? And so, for me, I'm an Enneagram 3, and so I drive, and then I don't have a problem resting, but when I kill the engine, I just kind of check out entirely. And so the rest may not actually be purposeful or even productive if we've not chosen to rest in meaningful ways that fit our design. And so we're going to talk about what Sabbath and rest should look like, but helping kind of get people into a little bit more reflection of, do you rest? Are you driven where you never stop? Or do you rest way too much? and there's a balance on the other side of that. And then why? Why is rest easy or hard for you? And giving people a chance to kind of be a little bit more reflective before we kind of get into maybe what rest should look like and how we do it well.
Yeah, so good. And of course, the third question there is just talking about wise counsel in our lives, the way Jethro was for Moses. I think that's another. I mean, there's so many like important aspects to our walk with the Lord that this whole section brings up. So use your best judgment on how you can spend your time in your group talking about those things. So yeah, the spiritual practice this week is practicing Sabbath, and a little reminder of what the word means. And I think it's important to talk about sort of the difference between a holy day and a holiday. That's what this practicing Sabbath is a cessation of our normal work and the concerns and the preoccupations even that we may have for the purpose of life-giving connection and communion with God and with the body of Christ. And so those purposes then can inform the practice. We again have to be reminded that we have limits on our capacities. We're not machines. That we need refreshment, and we need to feel the provision of the Lord, not carrying us. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary," not run to something else. Come to Him. And so I think it would just be great. You could even start out with, does anybody have a regular practice of Sabbath in our group? Just get the conversation started, and then maybe just pick a few ideas here that you might talk about. Would this work for you, for us? Even if you can't Sabbath for a 24-hour period, what I did when I started trying to do this is to even combine it with going to a worship service on a Sunday morning, and then the afternoon after that, maybe even just 3 hours of just a time of rest and doing something life-giving that worked with our family. It's one of the things we wrote in here is that resting is countercultural. There's so many things that resistance is going to pop up if you try this. And I think just acknowledging that in the group is just saying, this is not easy in our culture. And we're sort of like the people of Israel. We are trying to live in a way that's different than the world around us. And it's powerful. And it'll be interesting to see how your group does. And one thing I would encourage you is next week, especially, come back to this and ask, and say, we're going to check in next week and see how did we do on even practicing rest and Sabbath in just a small way even.
You kind of talk about how Sabbath is countercultural, or there are forces that kind of create resistance in us. I think there's two voices I know for me as I think about the reflection question and then think about Sabbath that can kind of create resistance to stopping. And one is guilt and one is anxiety. And so guilt typically says, I can't stop till it's all done. And that worked in college when life was in semesters and the class closed, but the rest of life and adulting, it's never done. Nothing's ever done. And so guilt kind of says you can't stop till it's all done or it's done right. And then anxiety is the other voice that says you can't stop, because if you stop, it's all going to collapse around you. And so if you stop running on the treadmill, then everything's going to fall apart. And those two voices, I think, particularly are effective at getting us to not rest. And so Mark Buchanan writes in a book called The Rest of God, kind of zeroing in on this idea of Sabbath. And he's hearkening back to why was Sabbath such a big deal for the nation of Israel. And I love this quote, and he says it this way, thinking about how they came out of slavery, and Sabbath was to, in a sense, retrain them out of slavery. And he says this, he says, the lie the taskmasters want you to swallow is that you cannot rest until your work is all done and is done better than you're currently doing it. But the faith is that the work's never done, and it's never done quite right. It's always more than you can finish and less than you had hoped for. Sabbath is a stop work order in the midst of work that's never complete, never polished. Sabbath is not the break that we're allotted at the tail end of completing all of our obligations. It's the rest we take smack dab in the middle of all of it, without apology, without guilt, and for no better reason than God told us we could. And so I love that it kind of flies right in the face of guilt. It flies right in the face of anxiety. and it's meant to train us to avoid and overpower those voices in some ways. The other thing I would add is sometimes we connect rest with distraction or leisure. And so, as Caroline was talking about, Sabbath is a kind of disengagement and it's a kind of engagement. And so, leisure can sometimes be a vacating out, a vacation out, to not engage on anything at all. And so, what Sabbath is an element of devotion, an element of focus. And so, that's kind of one of the things we want to try to highlight is sometimes you can Netflix binge something and it's actually not restful because you didn't actually engage, you just vacated. And that actually is not what Sabbath and rest is meant to be. And so what does it look like to do it in moderation? How do we have the right balance of activities so that we find ourselves refreshed in the presence of the Lord as we walk through the provisions he's granted us in his creation and in our lives to find rest and to find him in it?
Yeah, so good. Well, that's what we have for you guys this week. We're really praying for you that these practices and the text and the Spirit all working together is forming your group into a people of God.
We'll see you next week.